that at the last moment have maybe a commitment. They receive some type of request. I'm talking about the ambassador of Portugal. So we immediately took the opportunity to have a very interesting debate today on inclusion policies. It's one of the principles that is under attack in some area of the world, and we think that it deserves a good debate and a good conversation today. I leave it with you and our professional mediator, Carmine. You'll do it. Thanks very much, and a round of applause to our guest.
All right. Oof, that's. Can we tone down the volume just a tiny little bit? Bassiamo il volume un pochino. It's still a Friday morning, right? Anyway, welcome everybody. It's great to see you all back. My name is Carmine Soprano. I'm an economist at the World Bank. I also consult for a number of UN agencies, and I teach at a couple of universities here in Rome. It's my greatest pleasure to be able to chair and moderate today's session. And I want to start by thanking all those who've made it possible for this to happen, even at the last minute. And therefore, first and foremost, Centro Studi Americani, that every year hosts us in these incredibly beautiful premises. It's always a big emotion to come back in these big rooms, right? Then second, of course, Diplomacy Festival and our good friend and big boss, Secretary General, Dr. Giorgio Bartolomucci, for having put together an absolutely stellar program of 100+ events that have ravaged through Rome over the past 10+ days now, across dozens of venues, gathering all sorts of folks from academia, analysts, diplomacy, and so on and so forth. It's a fantastic program. And this year we're turning 16th. But then most importantly, I want to thank each and every one of you for having joined us today, because as you now know, I wear multiple hats. And I have to because I'm a practically bald man, as I can see. But the one hat that I like enjoying the most, particularly now that we're going into the cold weather, is the academic one. Because there is a unique emotion and opportunity in exchanging views with bright, smart students like you all. And we're really looking forward to your pertinent and hopefully highly impertinent questions. Now, having said that, today's session is going to have the following structure. I'll say a few words just to draw the perimeter of the conversation, but then I'll immediately hand it over to our two highly distinguished speakers, whom I will introduce to you all throughout the session. And then most importantly, we're going to have plenty of time for Q&A because we have 90 minutes today and a room full of students. Okay. You now know I'm an economist. You will know that economists like numbers. So you'll have to excuse myself if I throw one just right at you all. $28 trillion. This is the amount that a 2015 McKinsey report had estimated that could have been added to the world's economy if all gender gaps were to be closed by 2025. You have absolutely nothing to worry about that because there's no way that we're going to meet that target. And in fact, if you look at another number, this time from the World Economic Forum, it might take us another 134 years before all of those gender gaps are closed. The reason why I'm citing this figure is that there's quite a lot that's been happening in the so-called diversity, equity, and inclusion space, DEI in short, over the 10+ years. And I thought it would be important to recap some of it. Again, to have a little bit of background to today's conversation. So let's rewind it back to 2012. There I was as a young professional working in Development Corporation, looking for a job in Washington, D.C., aspiring to join the World Bank, which I would have landed eventually. Meanwhile, my bank colleagues had just put out the 2012 World Development Report. And those of you doing stuff in development economics will know that the WDR, as we call it in short, is the Bible of international cooperation. And for the very first time ever in the history of the series, WDR was themed around gender equality. Fast forwarding to 2015, there are 3 major texts / landmark agreements that help us put DEI, but also sustainable development, front and center in the global agenda. First comes late Pope Francis Laudato Si encyclical, which for the very first time in the 2,000-year history of the Catholic Church decides to focus on the protection of the environment. September 2015, the United Nations adopted the 2030 agenda centered on the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, of which there is one dedicated to gender equality, which is number SDG 5, that's right. But you should not have said that, Kirsten. Anyway, and then towards the end of 2015, what remains so far the most significant agreement in international climate diplomacy also is finalized, the Paris Agreement. All this to say that by early 2016, diversity, equity, inclusion, climate, gender, sustainable development are the themes of the world. International community, analysts, civil society, the private sector start working, analyzing, and very importantly, funding these issues. Fast forward that a little further. Fall of 2017, former Hollywood mogul Harvey Weinstein is accused of sexual assault. He will eventually be convicted of that. Will have to resign his multiple positions in the film industry. And that episode, alongside a number of other accusations that come forward, help create what would become known as the Me Too movement, this global, virtual, and then also in-person awakening of raising awareness around how to prevent and mitigate sexual harassment in the workplace. What's the meaning of consent? And what role we all, including men, very importantly, can and should play in transforming social norms. So a lot has been happening on this DEI track. And there's another one that's been running parallel to it, which revolves around racial equality and racial justice. Allow me to rewind it back one more time. 2013, 2014, hang on, there's a lot. We have time. In the aftermath of the shootings of two young African Americans, Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown, another mass protest movement known as Black Lives Matter originates, right? It will peak eventually around May 2020 following the horrific murder of another African American, Mr. George Floyd, at the hands, or I should rather say at the knees, of a white police officer. The BLM movement will ultimately mobilize dozens of millions of people all around the world. And around 2014, it will choose the Stay Woke slogan to indeed raise awareness about racial profiling in the police corps and racial injustices. That's a slogan that had been introduced back in the 1930s and which became politicized around 1970s, right? As of 2019, however, the term woke starts being attributed as somewhat pejorative meaning, and it becomes being used, particularly in the conservative camp, as a synonymous, or so they would say, of supposed excesses of political correctness, and as a way to signify some form of ostracism vis-a-vis those who have a different and indeed typically differently conservative opinion vis-a-vis the so-called progressives and liberals. Fast forward it one last time, fall 2024, Donald Trump is reelected as 47th president of the United States on a platform that, among other things, appear to have declared a semantic but also real war on the so-called DEI agenda. This is the perimeter for today, and clearly there is a lot. So it's probably time for me to shut up at this stage and let our two very distinguished speakers start diving deeper into some of these issues. And I want to start with Dr. Virginia Di Gaetano. Dr. Di Gaetano is an established writer, blogger, journalist here in Rome, whose excellent work has been so far featured on many outlets, including the very obscure ones, such as BBC, Travel, and Lonely Planet. No one knows those, right? Exactly. And she holds a PhD in political science and governance from Sorbonne University in Paris, and also degrees from McGill University in Canada. So Virginia, words do matter. And they particularly matter in the context of international politics and diplomacy, right? So can you talk us through the significance of language and why some, and perhaps you yourself also, think that the current attack that the sitting US administration is waging on certain words has a particularly important and somewhat worrying meaning? Thank you.
I'm very sorry. Is that okay? I didn't blow out your. How you guys, do you feel, I mean, it's just almost the very end, isn't it? We're right before lunch. You're doing great. Okay. You're doing great. It's not going to be so painful. Anyway, I promise. I almost promise it's going to be a little painful. So this man right here, I mean, besides the fact looking like the coolest guy in 1972, right? His name is Roland Barthes, and he is one of the most prominent names in the field of semiology. Have you heard of semiology? Anybody? Hands up if you've heard of semiology at all. Okay. Quick question. Say you have a crush on someone, right? A little crush, right? Something like that. And you want them to know. You want to do something nice. Man, woman, any version therein of the spectrum. What would you get them? If you were going to give a gift to someone that you wanted them to know that you wanted to have a relationship with them, whatever the relationship, but you didn't know them very well, what would you give them? Anybody? Chocolate? Flowers? You wouldn't give them an onion. Probably not. Probably you wouldn't get that, because that's a big move, isn't it? The reason why, so why is that? Why is that? Why is it that we're up on this stage here? Why? Okay, but what are norms? What are norms? Norms are the signs and symbols that we use to establish meaning and live together as a society. That is semiology. That's it. So our man here, Roland Barthes, he was one of the big kind of dudes in this. And he defined semiology as the system of signs, whatever their substance and limits. So images, gestures, sounds, objects, and the whole web of these things all together. All of these things, these become convention, norms. Money, things like that. The reason that we have money and the reason that we know what money means to each other is because somewhere along the line, somebody said, okay, I can't keep trading my goats for your stone, because I don't need any more stone and you don't need any more goats, but I would really like to buy other stuff, so let's have money. All of these things are signifiers that allow us to communicate with each other. That's what semiology is. It sounds very fancy. It is very fancy, but it's only because academics go to school and we need to do something afterwards. So we have to invent better fields and sound fancier. You guys will get it. This is gonna be great. So now on top of this idea of what this means, right? So we start to look at things like this. Now, we look at flowers as a way to establish the idea of a romantic interest, right? Roses, specifically. Roland Barthes wrote about the idea that roses signify this idea. The convertible, the idea of freedom. Look at those happy people. They're so free. The notion that red wine is somewhat healthier for you. And the idea that Albert Einstein's brain is somehow something really special, right? This is what he called the second order of meaning. And what he called this is, and what this becomes, is what we know as myth. Mythologies. And so his book, Mythologies, was about saying that when we get these concepts, so the board's staying here, when we have these concepts, right, all these together, myths have meaning and they also have a function. We don't just make up a myth, or we don't just develop these myths just to have them, right? We use them. We do things with them, right? Because we don't just give an onion to somebody that we like. We give them roses and we use that. And then industry comes up around that. That form takes a meaning. And all of a sudden then roses, for example, take on a certain level of power. So myth is about power. Sometimes the power is just the power to get you flowers, the power to get wine, the power to have a big brain, and the power to take a drive. But other times, myth forms the basis of political power. So what Roland Barthes says about that is that the major function, Raphael, I just absolutely, he's like done, is to naturalize power. Thank you. So it purifies the signs, it fills them with a new meaning that is relevant to the people creating the myth. So when we're talking about political power, then we talk about people who create myths. And why do they do that? Why do we create myths? Why do we create any of these things? Because it allows it to seem as though what we're saying and what we're doing has always been there. So we make people believe that it's always been this way, or we make people believe that somehow these things have meaning in and of themselves. So by doing that, we boil everything down into something simple, something bite-sized. It's very easy now. We boil it down to a TikTok. We boil it down to 2 minutes where we hope we understand the world because somebody has explained it to us through different myths, right? We all do it. And of course we have to do it because the world is very big and complicated and life is hard and you guys are tired and we're all tired and everybody's a little bit hungry. And we're all just kind of in need of a nap, aren't we? So if somebody's going to explain the world to us in an easy way, great, thank you, right? What we don't realize necessarily is that we are then giving that power to those who are making those myths. And another sociologist from the French school, Pierre Bourdieu, who was very fundamental, not so much in semiology, but in understanding how beliefs form this really fundamental part of society, said, what the things that we think go without saying are that way because they come without saying. Nobody says it. Nobody tells you all of a sudden, get the roses. That'll show them. Go for a drive, you'll feel good and free. Don't get an onion, they'll think you're weird. We know it. How do we know it? Because we do. That is myth, right? So the basis of that forms our society. We need that. But when it is used for political gain, then it starts to become something that takes a little bit more of a there's a hegemony. There's a hegemonic power that's reaching into our lives and gives us that assurance of something that we haven't actually agreed to. So it does remove consent inherently. Myth has the function of removing our consent even before we realize that we haven't even been there to give it. So we start to, so this is the creation. So going back to what was just really what beautifully explained, I mean, I couldn't plan that better, of the idea that when we talk about the development of the woke movement, right, which was quite an organic thing. And Roland Barthes will write about this. He writes about myths on the left and myths on the right. And one of the things that he says is that myths on the left are always less successful because they're always too sincere. They're always too earnest. They don't have that sense of sort of, they don't have there's not a cunningness to them. They're always a little bit too superficial because they don't quite root in that way, right? And so we find that way. But on the right, there's a tremendous amount of strategies that they use in order to inculcate in each of us this little power. And one of the things that happens in particular is the notion of tautologies. Can anybody think of a tautology off the top of their head? I'll give you one. Has anyone ever said or heard someone say, it is what it is? Have any of you ever said that? It is what it is. What does that mean? Nobody knows. What does that mean? It is what it is. It doesn't mean and Barthes will say, tautology is an ugly word because it's an ugly concept, because we are defining the thing by the thing itself. It sounds very compact. It sounds as though we've made some great statement, doesn't it? We sign it, we put it on Instagram and people go, oh, it is what it is. It is. It doesn't make any sense. But it's this mythological belief that somehow we've explained the world. But actually, we haven't done anything at all. We've convinced ourselves of that. And the anti-woke movement that comes up. Oh, I should probably move that. It's not connected. So now this idea of being anti-woke, right? Because I used to be woke, but now I'm awake. What does that mean? It doesn't mean anything. It's a tautology that comes in. It's a tautology that comes in with an incredible amount of symbolism, because also the symbolism of someone who is not clearly identifiably white Caucasian female, saying that she used to be woke, but now she's awake, is a message that's being communicated as well. It's a myth that's saying, look, see, we're inclusive. We're just better inclusive. See, look at the cool sheep. See the sheep that's really cool over there? He's saying no. What? When you look at the semiology, the signs, the symbols of everything that the anti-woke movement displays, think, gosh, what is it? What are they talking about? Leaving aside the fact that you may inherently disagree with it because it may offend some sense of morality or some sense of humanity or empathy. Leave that aside, because that's not where debate can really happen. Once we start arguing from an emotional position, we're in an intractable situation, aren't we? Diplomatically or otherwise. But when we start to look at how myths are created and thus how they are unraveled, then we start to look and see the symbology doesn't make much sense, the symbolism of it. But then when you hear the president who says, you know what woke means? It means you're a loser. So now what we see is this sort of, so again, keeping in mind this idea of what things signify, the creation of a myth. Then you have an overt, incredibly attractive gentleman. I mean, try to keep focused. I've chosen a particularly flattering photo as well. But then all of a sudden, you realize, so now putting yourself in the position of someone who is ready to believe or ready to accept that myth, ready to accept that second order of meaning, then it's a closed case. The loop closes. Woke means weak. And weakness is something that is the exact opposite of power. So the power is inherent in the message. And then all of a sudden, we start to understand why it is that officially on an administrative level and on a large scale, the administration is able to enact initiatives like renaming the Department of Defense the Department of War. Why would you bother? What's the point of it, right? Really. Again, without a myth, without this foundational myth, without this idea that somehow the naming of it as department, as war, rather than defense, but war. Do recipients of aid care whether it's named the Department of Defense, Department of War? Do people who are unable to afford to pay their rent or buy bread in Indiana care that it's been named the Department of War? Well, they shouldn't, right? But they do. Why? Because somehow, when you create a myth, and when you have given it enough of a basis to live inside of a society, you can convince people that to ensure peace, we must prepare for war. And therefore, we have to name the Department of War. Why would you bother? Because of that idea of myth, the creation of myth that is deliberate and is complex. That's why it's dangerous to think that everything that these people do are sort of just random and haphazard. It's not. They probably don't know Roland Barthes, but they don't not know what they're doing. Now, I just want to keep this up here. So, in terms of, these are some of the words that are banned in the US communications. There are 350 of them so far. DEI is in there. All of these are in there now. So the idea of words having a particular relevance, right? Why would they bother? Why would they invest that money? They're banned from government communications. They're not allowed to be used in US internal government communications. So that Trump doctrine is now based on mythologizing existence through dominating language and practices by inverting meaning. So that's what they wound up doing, inverting that meaning by saying the woke agenda, we are the anti-woke. By inverting the meaning of what woke is to something that doesn't even make sense anymore. It doesn't make sense because, again, it's come without saying. It goes without saying because it comes without saying. And that's the process behind these things. So until you understand the process of it, we can rail against it as much as you want. And then you say, well, how are these people in power? What are they doing? So we need to understand this in order to figure out how we actually get past it.
Oh my goodness, that was a lot. Thank you so very much, Virginia. No, it was just what we needed. Meaning of semiology, significance of norms. Myth signifies power, but certain words don't really mean anything. And that's a perfect segue to you, Kirsten. So let me first introduce our second speaker of the day, Kirsten Engvik. Kirsten is the co-founder and CEO of WIN, an International Women in Leadership Initiative, which since its establishment back in 1997, has managed to gather and train over 200,000 leaders from all over the world. How impressive is that? It's also known as the Davos for women. And Kirsten is also an established public speaker, communicator, and activist. Spent a lot of time and effort in advancing this DEI agenda forward. And she's also a businesswoman, right? So she holds an MBA from Bocconi University here in Milan and a bachelor degree from the Norwegian Business School. So Kirsten, I think Virginia did a fantastic job in talking us through the significance of words. What I want to discuss with you then is what happens when a war gets waged at certain words, and therefore what are the implications for the underlying agendas that have been running on those words. We've spoken about DEI, we've spoken about sustainable development. There are also pretty significant financial implications because over that decade that I recapped for everybody in my intro, the so-called ESG, environmental, social, and governance investment strategy emerged and has now established itself as $20 trillion worth in asset type of investment strategy. So the money is kept flowing. People have prioritized certain words and run campaigns among them. And now all of this is happening. What is happening? Talk to us. Thank you so very much for being with us.
Okay, there's so many different ones. Anyway, thank you for the introduction. It's lovely to look out at all of you here. So this is a very interesting topic where we all have power to create a difference, actually. And to bridge from the previous the speaker, I'd like to say that over the past 20 years, within our organization, we have run something called the Diversity Forum. It became also D&I Forum. And I also run another meeting where we are talked about how we can create thriving organizations. And these meetings were more strategic, maybe higher level people in the organizations were meeting them. Now, this year, the meeting was hosted by a company, an American multinational. So they said to me, Christine, no social media, no mentioning of this meeting anywhere. Okay, I said, even inside the organization, we cannot call it the D&I forum. It has to be something else. So I said, okay, let's call it driving organizations. No, the content of the meeting was the same. We talked about the importance of sustainability, about inclusion, of creating good environments where everybody can do their very best, where we can create, where we feel safe enough to speak up, to bring our best ideas, to stay competitive, the company said. So they were super happy. And we brought in many other companies and they talked and shared and benchmarked. The name was not on the brochure, on the internet, in the intranet. So what we're seeing now is a war on language, as our speaker said. But also, it's being used in a way, the language is being weaponized to create conflict. And one of the sad things about this, or one realization, which is going to bring us to something good. You know what? This field was never, ever easy. I worked particularly on advancing women for almost 3 decades since I was a student. And it was always undervalued, underfunded. Often the organizations that were working with it were in some corner of the HR department. So often in a corporation or a big company or a small company or in the public administration, you have human resources. Under the director of human resources, there is a talent perhaps, and under that was the diversity and inclusion. So it was never or rarely at the very top. But now, the paradox of all of this is that we need to embrace diversity because our societies or public administrations or companies and our very lives need a mix of thoughts. And we need to feel safe so that we can be the best of ourselves. So when we're looking at this weaponization of a language, creating conflict, them and us, instead of all of us, we have a possibility also to take a stand and to evolve inclusion to something much stronger than it ever was. So the paradox we're seeing is that, yes, inclusion is a threat in the language. Budget is a threat. When I have run an organization primarily for women, and we relied on corporate partnerships and sponsorships, and this year the budget disappeared. We became more creative. So I brought a lot of students in to help us, volunteers. We were teaching, sharing, learning from the younger ones. We became more diverse because we had an intergenerational team. I had a lady who was in pension already and a student. So I saw in my little world how creative we became. Sure, we like to have the big budgets and hire people and do these things also. But there is some resilience that is built when we don't give up. And that is also important. Now, so what does also all of this actually mean? Because sometimes the change of meaning, there's change of words, and this is what is happening big time. So right now you can see in corporations and companies around the world, D&I is basically being wiped out as a word. But there are also people who are fighting back and are saying, no, 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 we want it, we want it, we want it. But perhaps also, as we know in our personal lives also, sometimes when we have a challenge, it's also a question for each and every one of us to step it up, to learn more. So in the beginning from Carmine, he said, you know, he referred to the World Economic Forum. There is something we know and that Trump doesn't speak about. But these countries in the World Economic Forum gender gap, so the countries that are leading where you have more gender parity, so let's use that, and this is not all diversities, but just look at gender. Many of the countries that are on the top of the gender gap is also on the top of another report, namely that of competitiveness. So if you look at many of the countries that are doing well in the world, many of these countries are also having better gender parity. If I look at companies that are doing well in the world, according to, for instance, A Good Place to Work or other statistical organizations, you see that many of those places also have a better gender mix in their group. And as individuals, and this is a very, very important point, if I surround myself with people from different countries or people who think different than me, I'm constantly being stimulated. And I have a possibility to become more intelligent or at least more awake. So I also wonder, is this war on the woke, is the woke anti-woke movement a strategy to dumb the nations, because if you're always only with the same people and think they are an enemy, instead of mixing with different people, we don't get the same stimulus. So countries, companies, and individual lives will benefit from inclusion. Now, if this is no longer possible everywhere in the public space, okay, we find new words. We find ways where we can thrive in our societies. We find ways where we can thrive in the companies or workplaces. And we find ways where we can thrive in our own lives. And yes, it's not easy. But we are also living in a time where humanity has to step up. And humanity matters. And each of all can follow our purpose. I tell you, I come from Norway. I grew up in Norway, which is normally number 1 or number 2 or number 3 on the gender gap report. And when I grew up, we had a female prime minister. So I grew up in a very homogeneous society otherwise. We didn't have so many people from other countries living in Norway when I was young. It has changed dramatically. But on the coast of Norway, people have been sailing. The Vikings went, different places. But I did grow up with a female prime minister. I did grow up being heard, seen, and valued relatively high compared to young women at the time in other countries around the planet. Then I started to travel. And I started to see, wow, it's not like this here. Oh my God, what about these women? What is happening to them? They're not heard, they're not seen. And then I discovered it wasn't only about women either. It was about what we can say, the caring, the sharing, the human side of both women and men that wasn't valued. Okay, so now we have a chance, each and every one of us, to say, no, I want to take a stake in the ground. I want to value humanity, that human part in all humans. And you know what? If I do that, if it's something I see in another irritates me, and if I work on myself to try to include that part, I grow. I become more intelligent, but I also evolve as a human. So at the moment, I think we're standing in front of quite an interesting time where we can evolve together and become a time of a better society. No, this is the optimistic view, of course. And I think we have no other choice. Let's put an optimistic view. No, also a little bit, when we talk about this terminology of things, what does diversity really mean? I mean, what does it mean to you? To anyone who wants to say, what does it mean to be in a diverse environment? Diversity, what does it mean? Yeah, please. Cultures and races. Uniqueness, yeah. Anyone else who wants to say something? Yeah. You want to say something? You with the scarf? Well, yeah. You bent forward. It looked like you wanted to talk. Oh, there's another gentleman. The voice of many? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. A way to express herself in our uniqueness. Yeah. And did you know that in nature, if they have fields now with the same sort of crops all over, there was an experiment I saw from the US of almond trees, and they had acres and acres and acres of almond trees, and suddenly the bees started to disappear. And then they discover that, okay, either they transport new bees into this area or they mix the vegetation. So you have some almond trees, you have some strawberries, you have some different, you need to mix. So the uniqueness, the different nationalities, let's say, the different plants also thrive if there is variety, and then the bees are there. So it is not only us humans. So what do we mean by inclusion? Or maybe talk to the person sitting next to you, and then I will hear from you afterwards too. What does it mean for you to feel included? Do you want to? Maybe being understood, yeah? Anyone wants to share also with the people? Because sometimes this feels private, sometimes they feel, what does it feel to be included? Because we have all felt excluded, you know? Even sometimes you see a white male, middle-aged, and you hear him too, he's feel excluded sometimes as well, you know? So everybody's probably had that experience. But what makes you feel included? Okay, everyone. Being yourself without being judged, yeah. To be respected, yeah, nice. Accepted. And you? No, no. I want to hear from some guys. And they don't feel included. I know it's a majority of women here. Wow. Oh, we want to hear a male voice. How about you over there? Not being discriminated, yeah. Wow. Yeah. Being acknowledged and not ignored, yeah. Acknowledge that somebody's taking up space, yeah. And what about you? Being understanding, not judged by anyone, yeah. Yeah. So we all want inclusion, right? Feels good. Yeah. So if inclusion, this beautiful feeling of being understood, of being heard, of not being judged, being respected, having uniqueness being possible, and if this now is under threat, exactly, what can we do now? What's a possible response in a practical way, both in policy level, in the work you're doing, but also as individuals in our own life? Because also, this is also something I want to step up now in this evolution. So it's not just a policy in the bureaucracy of the organizations and our countries, but now we are actually stepped up. Each and every one of us need to step up and say, it's about me. And I want to take, maybe you want to be a leader, or you want to be a follower of somebody who leads in a good way that is inclusive, because you feel that feeling of inclusion, you want to have it. So I think it's interesting now to think about, how do we want to respond to this when we see it? And the paradox sometimes is that, how can we respond without responding the way they are doing it? Namely, controlling people, weaponizing it, creating conflict. How can we respond in a more harmonious and human way? Yeah. And I think, is my time over? Yeah, okay. But think about it, please. Thank you.
I wanted to see you.
All right. Thank you so very much, Kirsten. I think you've done a fantastic job in reminding us about the very close link between inclusion and competitiveness. That's why I had taken the liberty of mentioning that $28 trillion figure. And there's a lot more empirical evidence reminding all of ourselves that companies with more diverse leadership are those that are more productive, more profitable, and better resilient at the time of crisis. These are the things that I've had the pleasure of discussing with my students when we teach gender economics and female entrepreneurship. You also very nicely alluded to the meaning of inclusion, and I love this little brainstorming. Get ready for more. And then you also mentioned the role of political leadership. No? You reminded me of that example. You might have heard of this when school kids in Germany had only seen Angela Merkel as their chancellor. And so when the question was run, what do you want to be? No one said, I want to be head of government, because they didn't think that a man could be that, right? But then at the same time, I think it's really interesting, and I'd be happy to hear students' voice on this, that at least across Europe, if you look around, the few countries, with the very exception of the Scandinavian ones, that have very always being ahead of the curve, kudos to you guys. The few examples where we see women that reach the very top of the political leadership, they typically come from conservative parties. Think of Italy, think of France, think of the UK, think even of European leadership, from Roberta Metsola to Christine Lagarde, Ursula von der Leyen, etc. So I would be really interested in understanding whether anyone has any views on that. And then, of course, what can we do about all of this? And that is the perfect segue to Q&A. But the one last thing I wanted to say, and I'm going to back to you, is that in case you haven't noticed, we probably have a little bit of a bias on this panel with regards to these topics. But I think all voices need to be heard. And there is a camp, including with people of your age, that is increasingly developing or aligning themselves with conservative positions. If you think of Charlie Kirk, who was very sadly shot recently, he certainly did have extreme or at least polarizing positions, but according to some, he was practicing politics in the very way that it would need to be practiced. He would go speak to students in campus, engage in debates, and touch on very difficult concepts. And the number of young people, particularly young men, I must say, who are increasingly turning towards conservative or far-right extremist parties is growing in America and also to a certain extent across Europe. So all views have place here. And why don't we take the first, let's take maybe 2 or 3 questions, and then that can be a question, a comment, a clarification, as long as you introduce yourself and go straight to the point. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Dana. So I want to discuss something. Most of the companies, they always have this magical card that they would raise whenever you ask for gender diversity, that the female employees would cost them more because of the maternity leave, the insurance, the ministerial breaks, and so on. So this is something that needs to be answered from a bigger perspective. Insurance companies, whatever, who will cover for their maternity leaves, because it is not okay for us to give up our rights just because we will cost the company more and we would lose our opportunity to be hired.
One point. Let's take maybe 2 or 3, and then we handle all of them at the same time. There's one here, one there. And man, either you volunteer or you will be volunteered. So get ready with your question. Can we get a microphone somewhere? Okay, go ahead.
Thank you for your speeches. I'm Sofia, I'm an Italian student. I think that my question is maybe specific for journalist Di Gaetano. So you talked about the methodologies, let's say, from a rhetoric point of view, which are used by the right nowadays, in the specific case of Trump. Last year, when I prepared for the history exam, I had the chance to read an essay by Emilio Gentile, which was based on this topic exactly. He talked about the myths and the rhetoric used by Mussolini during the fascist period. And it was exactly based on this. So the creation of myths, for example, the myth of the Superuomo, I don't know if it's Superman in English, and then the myth of Rome, for example, and all that. So considering that also nowadays we see the rise of right-wing parties basically all over the world, not just in Europe, who are based on this kind of rhetoric, do you think that this is what the left-wing parties are lacking? I mean, maybe if they had some kind of a similar rhetoric, they would not be, surpassed somehow, and they would have bigger audience or something like that. So yeah, that's my question.
Excellent. Let's take a third one, and then we're gonna start offering some thoughts, and then we'll do another round. No worries.
Oh, okay, I'm so sorry. Hi, I'm Arianna. I'm an Italian student, and I had a question specifically for journalist Di Gaetano. So you've talked about the strategies that Donald Trump and the Conservative Party in the US uses to sort of radicalize people. And you've also mentioned the renaming of the Department of Defense into the Department of War. What I wanted to say, or to ask specifically, was what is it about these rhetorics that makes them land? Like, what is it about them that makes people go, okay, I want to do that. I want to subscribe to this ideology specifically. And you've also mentioned that there's a lot of strategy that goes into these plannings, that they're very like complicated and articulated and intentional. So why is it that the right methodologies in the political sense are more successful than the left ones, who you've described are more sincere? Like, shouldn't the left ones be easier to understand and therefore a bit more accessible to people? So, I mean, it's two questions in the end. So thank you.
Thanks. And they tie nicely with the other questions. So maybe you can answer them both together, Virginia. Everyone wants to talk to you about this session. But I want to go to Kirsten first with the first one. Do female employees really cost us more? Let the businesswoman speak.
Yeah, well, sort of social businesswoman. Right? No, it's in some countries they cost more on the first look. So you look and it's okay because the maternity leave is cost in terms of the social benefits return. Sometimes it's covered by the government, so it's not the company, but the company needs to replace, costs money to hire somebody again, and so on. Okay, so it looks like that. Okay. But then, of course, in some other countries now, there is paternity leave, we change it, everything together. But there is another thing that we have noticed also. And there is a high evidence that males in the early part of their career, or in the so-called years when many women and men have families and children, that men change jobs more often. So you hire a woman and a man at the same time. 3 years later, the woman is off with a baby. The man is supposed to help her and be with her also. But meanwhile, he's off to another job. So the company still needs to train another one. She may come back, be super efficient because she needs to leave early and take care of the child, you know. Or in an ideal world, the man is also part of it. But there's a lot of evidence that actually doesn't cost that much more, if at all, because often parents, and particularly in countries where it's mostly land on the women, end up being very responsible employees. They take a lot of responsibility. And I even have, I would like to research, but it's my own research. I even met single mothers who had to make a better career, who had to find income, and who had fabulous careers because they sort of magically had. But the driver wasn't only the money and so on. The driver was love. And perhaps that's also for many men that are fathers also. But okay, sorry, one more thing. And meanwhile, working in politics, since you're in also international relations and policy, etc., we need to work on countries to make sure we have fair policies that also benefit some of our gentlemen in the room, because sometimes they're also held out. So yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Kirsten. Let me also say something to that. I'll put on my gender economist ad for that one. Because it ultimately boils down, in my very humble opinion, to the equal, or rather say most often unequal, division of labor when it comes to unremunerated care burden within the household. And there's three things that revolve around that, which one is public policies, and you've mentioned parental leave. Second one is social norms. The third one is social infrastructure. Now, when it comes to parental policy, let's take the example of Italy. It makes absolutely no sense that the father's leave is 10 days only. That's ridiculous. That's nothing, right? So until you get to a point, citing the great example of Scandinavian countries again, I know about Sweden, but I'm pretty sure that Norway is also a good practice in that sense, where you have joint parental leave, 480 days per year, 16 months, of which 90 days per parent are mandatory, and the rest can be exchanged so that they can decide internally within the household who goes back to work first, who takes the leave later, etc. We're not going to get anywhere, right? So that's point number one. Point number two is on social norms. If you look at the amount of unremunerated domestic care work that men versus women do in Italy, it's 2 hours to 5, okay? So men on average do about 2 hours. Women do more than twice that amount. And it takes a lot of time to change that. It takes educating kids from the very early stages in school. It takes running campaign in a certain way. It takes doing joint focus group discussions to sensitize men and women about the importance of equal distribution of remunerated domestic care. And it is not a fact, to be perfectly frank with you all, that 80 to 90% of attendants today are women. That's exactly what I get in my own courses, meaning that we still have a lot of catching up to do. And we ourselves, men, have a very important role to play in acting as role model, or at least joining this very important fight. So it's public policy, it's social norm, it's social infrastructure. There's some really interesting research by colleagues at the London School of Economics, with which I also have an affiliation with my academic hat, about child penalty, okay? It shows that until a child is born in a family, the trajectory of men's and women's income stays pretty much the same. The moment the very first child is born, and that's true pretty much everywhere across Europe, including countries that are ahead of the curve in terms of public policies. The very moment the first child is born, women's income go like this, and they never catch up. They catch up a little bit, but never fully. It's called the Atlas of Child Penalty. I warmly recommend you all taking a look at that if you're interested in empirical evidence. But until you get the right public policies in place, the right social norms changed, and childcare fully available, free of charge, of good quality for all, you're not going to get very far. Sorry. Virginia. Yep. Yeah.
It's a very super thing. This child penalty is an interesting title, because we need also to maybe rethink, and you guys innovate how we value things. Because the thing is, the value of becoming a parent at an individual level, even if it's frustrating at times, or the value for society that we also have the next generation. Look at Italy, Japan, Germany. Where are the next children? So if we could find another word than penalty, so not only in an economic sense of the individual and the organization, but how can I value caring? How can we value this love thing that is in the sphere? And I think that's innovative thinking and practices that needs to be emerging from you.
Excellent. Enough for talking from the two of us. Virginia, over to you for those two questions on right wing versus left wing ideology, and why the right wing is so successful.
Yeah, that's somebody should study how important words are and why we use them, isn't it? That was a joke. It was a semiology, right? No. It is. So I think it's a funny thing, right? Because I always find it interesting that a president like Donald Trump, who runs on, and Donald Trump is just the best example. And by best example, I mean the most obvious or the most vulgar example, right? The most common example of this tendency. It's interesting how much he runs on the platform of being a businessman and a business president. Yet if it's true that you could infuse $28 trillion into the global economy by creating gender parity, well, then why don't you do it, right? Why don't you do it? And I'm not convinced that he doesn't. I'm not convinced that he doesn't do it because I think ideology is a very funny thing when you talk about Donald Trump. I think ideology is a very, very loaded and difficult word. Like, I'm not sure that he has a particular ideology as such in the way that we would think about it. He is a naked capitalist, an aggressive capitalist, and aggressive misogynist. And those things have combined to create a political agenda. However, it's not only that. So when we talk about semiology and we talk about strategy, the thing that's always important to understand is that it's often not conscious. It's not something that someone sits at a table and says, okay, how are we going to create meaning? They don't necessarily do that. They're not necessarily quite good at that. None of us are necessarily very good at that. The people who are very good at it, though, are people who work in marketing. And people who've often studied semiology are people who wind up making commercials and making publicity and making ads. That's where you're going to see a lot of these things that happen, because it is a question of selling an idea and selling a package of ideas, which goes back to the questions about why is the left always so bad at selling their message and the right is always so good at it? Well, One of the things that Roland Barthes would say about the left is that the left is always identifies itself with the language of the oppressed. So they're not just defining themselves in opposition, which of course the right wing is very good at doing, and which of course extreme right wing thought often emerges from opposition thought, right? So they're in opposition to something. So it's not the opposition as much as it is the oppressed. If you've not ever read Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed, this is a very good example of this. It's a book that I think everyone should read. Because there is a different way of learning. So it's about learning something and learning to be creative, learning to be innovative. Those are words and those are things that are much more typically defined with the left wing. Thinking for yourself, forming your own opinions, being creative, expressing yourself. Those are things that often are tools to liberate the oppressed. Now, those things are not very, very helpful for creating myth. They're very good for breaking myths. So the left is very bad at creating their own myths because they are centered around breaking myths. So how do you create your own? It's very difficult, isn't it? It comes out feeling false. That's why I think one of the most successful speakers, and actually just was on with a couple of friends in Washington, and they were saying that, I don't know if, is anyone from New York? So there's Zohran Mamdani right now, who is, anyone seen, you guys have seen Mamdani, right? So he's been incredibly successful at creating a message and creating some kind of movement around him, but basically that's because he's very good at selling himself. He's a very good marketer, right? Will he manage to but he's not trying to create myth, is he? So it's a quite different strategy there. Versus, I mean, if you were to take two very opposing figures from each other, Charlie Kirk and Zohran Mamdani, who are roughly of the same age bracket, who Mamdani grew up in a more financially advantageous family, a far more intellectual family. You know, but so then one, you know, look at them sort of in relation to each other. And we sort of begin to understand why is it that the right is so convincing. But what's very, very a very neat trick that's been pulled, and any men who are in the room right now, it's okay. I mean, you will have been, you are susceptible to this in a way that I'm not, is that this language of the oppressed begins to be communicated to you. You are oppressed. The anti-woke doctrine, that philosophy, has an incredible advantage taking that language of oppression and moving it back onto people who have been traditionally and still are dominant members of society. However, when you begin to believe that myth, then it starts to take hold, and then and then you say, that's how I gain power, by subscribing to that myth. The right is very, very good at that. And why are they good? Because inherently in the model of conservatism, there is this idea of holding on to power. And we hold on to power by keeping things the way they are. Innovation is not helpful for conservatives, is it? The idea is we keep everything as much as we can. So again, I mean, I think that's why it's really important to look at these things with another eye and say, why are they this way? Why do they defy our logic? Why? They don't make any sense. I mean, I get that people are not great. I get that, you know, why is Donald Trump even president? What are we doing? What's going on? Okay, fine, but really? And interrogate that a little bit more. That's why semiology is actually quite useful for that as a tool. I mean, I think that it is. Maybe if we see Amazon sales of Roland Barthes go up today in this room, we'll know it worked.
Excellent. Thank you so very much, Virginia. Okay, let's take another round of questions. There were a few more hands up. Oh my goodness, this is amazing. Yeah. Can we have the man?
If it's
Okay.
okay, I have one really quick that I'd like to ask and
Okay.
pass it around. So I wanted to ask something to Ms. Di Gaetano. Since you were talking about the weaponizing of language, I wanted to ask about that. I'm from Indiana, which you happened to bring up during your speech. And we have in my city a very large Hispanic population. So I wanted to ask about an issue that's affecting a lot of my friends and stuff right there right now. About the Supreme Court Noem v. Vasquez Perdomo case, which allowed ICE to consider factors like race and language, basically legalizing racial profiling. So I wanted to ask how you think the language of Spanish, and stuff like that, is being attacked and stuff like that. And specifically, what one priority would be that youth, corporations, and politicians should focus on to protect against systematic bias. And then also how inclusive policy frameworks can more effectively combat discriminative legislation.
Okay, thanks. Let's take a few more. And yep.
Hi, I'm George. I'm an Italian student. I want to ask to all of you who want to answer, given that you mentioned Nordic countries, Nordic policies and measures to inclusive and social measures, what's stopping governments, for example, the Italian one or any other government in Europe or all over the world, to just adopt the same type of measures, you know, copy, emulate them? I know there are different countries, different society, etc., but we can see that maybe other governments, for example, in Spain, they're trying to do so the same, even though it's very different from Sweden or Norway. So what's stopping those governments? Are there other interests that are not hidden or not that are stopping them? I mean, isn't it easier to just emulate? Thanks.
Excellent question. Okay, let's take another two. Maybe we have lots of hands up. This is amazing. Okay.
Hi, I'm Miranda. I'm from the UK, but also half Cuban. And this is kind of for all of you. I have had a lot of experiences speaking to people with different views, obviously. And what I find is that there's a lot of fear, insecurity. There's a feeling of being threatened that often pushes people to go for narratives of opposition, even if they're not necessarily beneficial to them. And I think it's hard to have any of these conversations without having emotion brought into it. However, in all those conversations I've had, I've tried to come at it from a logical point of view, which is frankly exhausting. But I was just wondering, what's the advice that you have to help to try and bring down people's barriers, even before you can start addressing a subject? What I find is it's just extremely hard now to bring people to the table. Yeah.
Excellent. Let's take a fourth one, and then hopefully there's time for another third and final round, please.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for this wonderful panel. So my point is that there is always promoted left and right together, and I see both points, I see both sides, I listen and understand their views. My question is, I don't know, rather philosophical. Why never it is promoted or popularized the central, I don't know, middle view of this? Because I can see the both sides victim narrative, as you said, power projection, and this collective memory of conservative and so on. So why not central, middle, like normal opinions between left and right?
Middle opinions, you said.
Yes.
Okay. Moderate. Well, the center has never been there.
Golden ratio.
Okay. So we got language weaponization in Indiana, and I think you can take that, Virginia. Then what's stopping governments from making sound policies? I'm happy to speak to that. Then we've got something on how to bring people's barriers down. And then we've got something about moderates. Yep, go ahead. Start answering something.
So on the question of, yes, there you go. Yeah. So, so this is a great example. This is a horrific example, not a great example. This is a terrible example of the way in which that movement of the use of language, the changing, the manipulation of myths has real, concrete, tangible outcomes, right? And I wanted to bring this back up because of the 350 plus words that are banned from internal government communications, you'll see that there is Hispanic and Hispanic minority, right, among those. And if you take a moment, I don't know what that is. Okay, if you take a moment, can you see the words? Okay, you'll see what kind of words we're looking at here. But the idea, again, the words do matter. They matter. And when they're not there, they matter. They matter more. And the fact that now there is the, the idea that Hispanic and Hispanic minority, those words cannot be used in official government internal communications, means that the notion, the identity of Hispanic or Hispanic minority doesn't exist. As soon as you remove that word, and I think going back to, there's a book also, there's Eric Hobsbawm wrote about the invention of tradition, right? The idea of invention, tradition is myth, and these cultures are all together. So once you take it away, you've done two things. You erase that population from existing, but in so doing, you dehumanize them. And the level of policing that exists in the United States, I'll speak only to the United States right now because it's, again, that most obvious example, is based on this inherent idea of dehumanizing those people who they are looking to expatriate in some way. They're not trying to deport, they're trying to erase. But they're not necessarily so worried about whether or not they're actually undocumented immigrants. Right? There becomes a different set of signifiers. So that's why that is so dangerous. That's the danger of those words existing that way. We might not think it's anything until it is something. Until you're the person who no longer exists in a government database. Until you say all of a sudden, I don't see half Cuban up there at all. It's because it's not. It's because it's not. And so those are the things that start to become so difficult and having to see. And that is why that language is so important. And if I can, very quickly, can I just start and answer your question about what do you do? How do you do? So, again, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, read it. Have you read it? You'll love it. You guys, you'll love it. You'll come out of here, you'll be different. When you're up against the idea of these foundational myths that are so powerful, when you're up against that notion, when you're trying to argue with someone who is within that tautology, if somebody says to you, it is what it is, what are you supposed to say? How do you respond to that? You can't. The idea of that, it closes the argument off so quickly. You can say to them, you can say, you know what I say? When somebody says it is what it is, I hate that phrase, by the way. When someone says it is what it is, I say, yes, but it isn't what it isn't. Because it sounds dumb, right? So the point is, as hard as it is to remove that emotion, because it is hard, you do find ways. And that's why you have to find ways to remove the emotion, because that idea, that level of myth depends on an emotional response from you. It depends on an emotional response because that's not logical. That's why one of the most important tools that the left has historically always had against tyranny, fascism, dictatorship is always humor. Always. It's humor. And there's so much literature about this. There's so much about this. You could talk about it. But there's a reason why comedians get targeted so often. It's because when you can make people laugh, when you can laugh at myth, you bust it, you destroy it. And so there's so much about that. But those are professional comedians that will come in and they do the job of doing that. But it's a hugely important tool for busting that kind of myth. And so it is the kind of thing. Also, don't take it out on yourself. Don't take it all on your own. Because it's hard. It is exhausting. It is.
Okay. Kirsten.
I was thinking about also that, let's continue on that last question. If we have groups of people also, like right now we are in a building with arts on the wall, a certain beauty, right? Outside the hall, there's certain beauty. And one of the human traits since the beginning of time is that humans also like to make things beautiful. We make art, we make music. And I've found that if we come together and if you can get everybody to listen to music together, or there is art around us and it's beauty around us, suddenly we start operating on a similar plane. No, so what's also interesting, I see, is very often in governments and in companies alike, those are also budgets that are being cut, support to artists, support to art, and so on. But we have to have an awareness, each and every one of us know, to stop. Bring art, bring beauty. Don't build ugly buildings anymore. Make sure you put art on your wall, because that everything speaks. So yeah, because now they're all squared, right? But in old times when we were more poor than now, they decorated them. So we continue to decorate, make beauty. And that's a phrase I love to say myself. Let beauty be the answer to the ugliness of this time. And it's not, superficial beauty, but the authenticity of a person. Somebody said authenticity, uniqueness. So that's a possible answer besides how we talk and what she was already mentioned. But I'm a big believer in art and beauty. And then you mentioned the left and the right, and that why can't we just listen to each opinion of each person somewhere in the center? And there is a possibility, if we are really visionary. I mean, you guys are the next generation to lead the countries and companies. Could it be that there is a complete new way that could emerge where it's more harmonious? Because I know so many people ask that, why don't you go into politics? And they say, no way. I don't want to go in politics. It's just a drama, and it's like you have to be corrupt and you have that. No, but maybe there's a new way where we can create a system where everybody's heard and seen. Maybe there's a new way coming that is more harmonious. So think big and think new. Don't be, stuck in these new rhetorics of creating conflict all the time. The winner and the loser, is an old way of thinking. Has to go.
Okay.
Just super quick. I would say super quick to that point. But also the reason why sometimes it's so hard to find a center is that in times when things become so polarized, it's, the bell curve sort of, everything moves to the edges and everyone is a little bit more extreme. So there's not a plan and everybody's moving over to the side. And unfortunately, I hate to say it, but it is sort of almost a cyclical thing that happens in politics. So we see now a time that's very polarized and very much on the edges. And then it does usually come back together. And that center does come back when people start to look for it more. There is a certain amount of it that is a sort of cyclical throughout history event. So you're not wrong to think, God, where is it gone? So just to say. Yeah.
Absolutely. And on a question about what's stopping governments from making sound policies. Look, I wish we were in a world where policy making was evidence-based. We are not, very, very unfortunately. Because if we were, we should see very different policies, not only on parental leave and DEI, but also on climate change and immigration and many other issues. The problem with that, and the economist, my inner self always screams when I have to say this, is that empirical evidence is not really cool, right? It doesn't make for a myth. It is cool to me, but not to the average of voters and the masses. It's not cool. It doesn't make for a myth. It doesn't cut out as a message that people can, see their souls inflamed about, right? So it's a lot easier to come out with a message somewhat more extremist, not necessarily based on evidence, but that speaks to that very identity politics that is at the root of polarization. This is also one of the reasons why the center is nowhere to be seen for at least 2 decades right now, right? At the same time, as a truly Democrat person myself, I firmly believe in the electoral mandates, and right-wing governments or conservatives are typically not elected on platforms that advocate for a more equal redistribution of the unremunerated care burden. So I don't expect any such governments to implement those policies, however sound they would be from an empirical standpoint. Then there are also issues, and here I'm going to another topic, which is at least equally polarized, which is immigration, where, you run on a certain platform, but then under the radar, you pass other policies because they do make business sense. If you think of the case of Italy here, there's something called Decreto Flussi, which is that measure that the government passes every 3 years to offer seasonal permits to temporary permits to seasonal workers. No one talks about the fact that the sitting government, which clearly is a conservative one, has more than doubled the amount of permits that have been made available for those seasonal workers. Why? Because I suspect businesses made enough pressure on their elected representatives that these reminded them that that decision simply made business sense. And so while that was squarely against the predominantly anti-immigration platform that they were elected on, they passed it. They did it so under the radar, and that it happened. So empirical evidence should be disseminated certainly more. But I see it a little difficult these days with the center nowhere to be seen. There was a time back in the 90s, for those of you who were born and remember it, but they might have read about it, Virginia, where the center used to be very popular. Think about Bill Clinton and Tony Blair and Barack Obama, more recently, Matteo Renzi, if you wish, here in Italy. We may have different opinions about the policies that these leaders have implemented, but those were center-left liberal leaders that ran on more centrist platforms. I don't see any of that happening these days. We need to close, but I want to give a chance for two last questions because this discussion is getting very interesting. 1 and 2, and then we close.
Thank you. Since we were talking about inclusion and you mentioned how women in power are mostly right-sided, and I see between the words females, feminism, I'm thinking about, for example, Meloni. She always played the man. She never wanted to be recognized as a woman. And yet we see that in politics, even if you act like a man, then you're only seen, as Trump described her, as a young, beautiful woman interested in politics, and not recognize her as a head of the government, as a prime minister. I recently listened to Wilson, a podcast by Francesco Costa, and he was saying with an expert that according to ISTA data, half of the women, Italian women, say that they don't know enough about politics, so they don't talk about it every day. They feel like they're not informed enough, while for men it's completely different. So my question is just like a reflection on where women fit into this inclusion. How can we change this, and why this happens, why they're mostly right-sided, and yeah, basically this. Thank you.
Excellent. And then there was another question that at the back, and then we'll close it.
Hi, my name is Alice, and my question is very similar to her question. Why do you think most women power in politics mostly come from far right or right parties? I mean, the latest example, one of the latest example, the newly elected Japanese prime minister. She's the first woman ever to be elected, and she has an ultra-conservative vision. Do you think that's totally random, or actually there's a reason behind that? Thank you.
Excellent. Anyone? Kirsten.
Hello? Yeah. Oh, okay. So, yeah, it's very, very, very interesting. What I have seen and also read statistics on. So when you have a minority of a certain group, let's say gender, very often it's a human adaptations behavior that goes, you adapt to that majority group, you know? So that's why we need to have a lot of different people all the time, so nobody becomes the dominating culture. But they say it's about 30%, okay? So when you have had years and years of minority of women, they will adapt to that culture, so they will behave like male or worse, because they get good at doing this way. And I think in many, many, many cases, they feel they have no choice. I used to be critical of these male women, but then I realized maybe in their culture, they were in such minority. And then my heart went out to them to think, but they feel probably they have no other choice. But slowly changing. And then I also realized the biggest problem here is what we can name the patriarchy. So this way of domination and control over others. Because I also realized that when men express also values or behavior of caring and sharing, they are also judged. So what we're really talking about in society now is not just about the gender discrimination, it's actually really value discrimination. So what have often been the caring, the sharing, the fact that we have intuition, the fact that we have a heart, that is highly, highly judged in women and in men, and even worse in men. So that's also why sustainability goes so slow, because even the word sustainability is being judged, and particularly if men take it on. But back to the women then. So what is going on in society when the women are you see, look, Meloni, she's actually a single mother, but she still speaks about marriage and but in her own life, she is not doing that. So again, maybe she feels she has to say, I don't know if it's speculative or a survival.
Virginia.
So I think it's interesting, right? I think there's a lot of question there. What Kirsten just touched on also is the sort of internalized misogyny, which does exist. The Meloni case is interesting because not only does she define herself in more masculine terms, but she's also used that posture of being the underdog, being an outsider. So really is defining herself in a totally different way. So I think there is definitely that aspect of that. On the right, if we follow, just looking at the way that the right creates its myth, it's more palatable in a way to have a woman that comes in through the right that can still encompass those kinds of values and talk about, the mother. Giorgia Meloni has adopted herself as the mother of the nation, and that language also becomes very powerful, that there is a maternal figure that exists, although it is maternal but yet masculine, because it rules to power. It speaks, it's sort of the will to power of that, but still switches around with the gender of it, because Kirsten is absolutely right that then the language of any kind of soft power becomes then sort of immediately ungendered and brought back and feminized. Right. And then the feminine is masculinized. So it is a strange thing that starts to happen. However, I would point out two quick things. I'd point out that I think in the United States example, the United States case, the idea of gender and the idea of having a female president is so far off. Hillary Clinton would have been just as much of a leader of any of this sort of caliber. She was not a progressive, though she was on the Democratic Party. One would not in any right universe call her progressive. She didn't win because misogyny is one of the most difficult and most well-entrenched values in the United States, regardless of the party in power. So the rise of the female leader who is on the right and who has, since Margaret Thatcher really, and also I think Margaret Thatcher really defined herself as the male female, that figure. But at the same time, keep in mind that opposition figures are also more and more prevalently women. So there is something also to be said that women as opposition figures in opposition movements and different movements are also becoming more powerful, more present in Iran, movements in Iran. The Nobel Peace Prize winner who is in, Venezuela, Francesca Albanese. We see women who are also in opposition, who are taking incredible risks of their own safety at times and also standing up. So there is a pivotal moment here where, although we do have to look to the right wing tendency in world leadership, there is also something very powerful, very important to remember and to support with women who are forming a very, very substantial part of opposition to that power structure.
Okay, excellent. And on that note, I think it's time for lunch. I will not try to... I will not try to summarize any of this because we're all hungry. The only thing I wanted to say is that at the time of increasingly polarized politics, where identities and myths have become so important, it all starts with a conversation, just like we've done this morning. It's a conversation that ideally should be evidence and data-based. And it's a conversation, as we were saying earlier, answering one of the very good questions that you all had for ourselves. A conversation should not be judgmental or patronizing. They should welcome all opinions and being as inclusive as possible. This is exactly the spirit of Diplomacy Festival. So given this is the last day of the festival, I invite you all to devote another round of applause to Dr. Giorgio Bartolomucci and the festival team for their fantastic work for the 16th edition. And this does not stop here, because as you know, there's a long-lasting partnership with each of the universities that you come from. So we look forward to seeing you all for the 17th edition of the festival next year. And there's another session, of course, in afternoon. It really never stops. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great lunch.